Una vez más, buenos días a todos y a todas. Bienvenidos a más esta edición de nuestra serie de webinarios. Tenemos hoy la edición de número 32 de los webinarios de RedETSA. Hoy vamos a tener una invitada muy especial, mi colega Tessa Tan-Torres Edejer, de Ginebra, do OMS em Ginebra. Vou apresentá-la em um rato de maneira mais adequada. O documento eu vou passar em inglês para apresentar a Tessa e pedir a ustedes que aqueles que necessitem de tradução, recordar que temos interpretação na sessão, assim que podem buscar aí a opção de interpretação abaixo, aí em Zoom, e elegir o canal que pode quedar em canal sem interpretação nenhuma, se não necessitam, ou elegir o canal apropriado. Ok? E eu vou passar em inglês agora para ser a apresentação de Tessa. So, as I was mentioning, we are very happy today to have my colleague, Tessa Tan-Torres Edejer, with us. Tessa is the head of the Unit on Economic Analysis and Evaluation under the Department of Health Systems Governance and Financing in the UHC and Life Course Division in WHO headquarters in Geneva. For the past 20 years, Tessa has been primarily responsible for leading the work on defining the cost effectiveness of health interventions, WHO Choice. I think everybody knows about this great initiative and the leadership by Tessa, and the cost of scaling up and reaching health goals and targets. Ongoing work revolves around fair resource allocation, priority setting, and explicit equity efficiency trade-offs, health technology assessment, and the development of One Health, which is UN interagency health sector costing, cost effectiveness, and planning tool. Currently, there is a focus on integrated epidemiology and macroeconomic modeling for COVID-19 and how this can help with defining vaccine rollout strategies while calibrating public health and social measures. So we are really glad that Tessa accepted our invitation to be here with us today to present a WHO document, Institutionalizing Health Technology Assessment Mechanism, a how-to guide. The document was published in March this year. Francisco is going to put the link to access the document on the chat. We have disseminated already the document in our members, but if you don't know how to access, you can look at the chat. You can find the link. We are going to have a presentation, initial presentation from 25 to 30 minutes by Tessa. And then we have our Q&A session on 15 to 20 minutes and final closure. We hope to keep this around 1 hour 15 maximum, the sessions, okay? Questions can be made on the chat and will be answered at the end after the presentation. Webinar is being recorded, and as always are going to be available in our website redetsa.org if you want to disseminate and if you want to watch again. Okay, so I would like to thank you all, Francisco Cacave and Abraham and Gabriela, for all the help to organize the session, and then of course thank you very much, Tessa, for accepting this invitation. Tessa, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being with us today. Go ahead.
Okay. Buenos días, and do you say a todos or to all? And that's the extent of my Spanish at the moment, but I am very happy to be with all of you. So let me share my screen. So please confirm if you see my screen.
Yes, we see it well.
Okay. So as Alexander said, we had this publication out in March of this year, although it was actually ready for quite some time, but it took a few steps to get it cleared. So this is about institutionalizing health technology assessment mechanisms, and it is a how-to guide. I think the first thing that we need to define are the words in the title. I will define what institutionalizing means. I will leave the term health technology assessment undefined because I believe that most of you are actually doing it. And then we will explain why we use the words mechanisms versus agencies or some formal structure. So let me go to the first slide. Okay. So what does institutionalizing mean? I go back to a very old document from WHO Euro, and this was done in 2001. Where they said that institutionalizing refers to promoting structures and processes suitable to produce technology assessments that will be powerful in guiding policy and clinical practice towards the best possible health and cost, and maybe we should add here, and other important outcomes. I put in the word systematically because for me that is very important. It wasn't there in the original definition, but I think this is what institutionalizing also means, that it is always systematically used in any resource allocation decision. We use the word mechanisms in the book because we were actually very concerned that we would not give the impression that we wanted every country to put up an agency, and that we were more concerned with structures and processes that actually produce technology assessments and make sure that they are used in practice. So the intended audience, these are for people in countries that have already made the decision that they require a health technology assessment mechanism. It is not meant to persuade countries. So if you are not yet persuaded about HTA, this is not the document for you. There are many other documents for that. This is, you know you want HTA, you know you want to institutionalize it. So how will you do it? So this is a how-to book. It's very operational in its approach. It is structured into 5 chapters. The first one is establishing a mandate for HTA. Number 2, very important, something we frequently forget about, establishing a legal framework. And then establishing the institutional arrangements, the links to the data inputs, the links to the recommendations or decision-making bodies. We also look at the procedural aspects of assessment and appraisal, and how do you actually set up these mechanisms. And then we also need to monitor and evaluate the performance of the HTA mechanism. As with everything that we do, we need to know if we're making progress. This book was designed to be very practical, very operational, with checklists in every chapter to support implementation. It was also intended to be short, although some of the authors didn't stick to that. We were given a mandate of 10 to 12, so some slightly exceeded that. And the idea was we would put in annotated reading lists at the end of every chapter for further conceptual understanding. So going back, this is not a how to do a health technology assessment. This is a how to institutionalize an HTA mechanism. How to do a health technology assessment, we assume all of you in this audience know how to do it, or if you wanted to improve, there are many other documents which will help you with this. So we think that many countries can be classified according to the range of their HTA activities. And and we think that this range of HTA activities correlate very closely with the health system strength. So we have fragile states here who are mostly about defining the most essential of services. And then you have low-income countries with low coverage with a very limited or no mandate at all for HTA, and they define PHC packages. They don't necessarily have a link to policymaking. You have middle-income countries with low or medium coverage where they can define essential services beyond primary health care level. They are able to strengthen resource allocation decisions. So there is some impact of their HTA, and they have quite a complex methodology, sophisticated methodology, because they are able to collect more data. And then you have the high income countries where they actually do more of the marginal or incremental additions to their benefit package. And they have an expanding mandate, and they're able to share their knowledge and resources. So this particular document is probably directed to this sorts of countries, low income, middle income with low to medium coverage. High income countries probably already have something and are not probably going to redo their HTA mechanism. So what do we have in PAHO? We did a very quick summary of the results. This is a WHO HTA survey, which we ran in 2020. It was intended to be a global survey. In PAHO, we were not actually able to circulate the actual survey, but our colleagues in PAHO were very kind enough to help us generate from your RedETSA survey and from their expert knowledge country reports, so that we are actually able to report on 23 countries, or around 66% here. And so, for example, for the question, does your country have a systematic formal process by which information is gathered to support healthcare decision-making? We have 15 countries answering yes at the national level. We also have some which are answering yes at the subnational level, and some answer none. And as you can note, this doesn't total 23. It is actually you are given a choice. You could answer yes at the national level, and you could also answer yes at the subnational level. So there are some countries which still don't have this, or maybe they already have it. They have it at the national level, but maybe they are not yet institutionalized. So maybe this document will be useful for you, and we hope it will be. So every chapter is organized like this. This is the first page that you will see, and it gives you a summary of the major steps in each of the chapters. So you will recognize this front page in every chapter. The way I will go through this, because it's 57 pages, I cannot cover everything. We will go through each of the steps, and then I will focus in the subsequent slides on a specific area of that particular chapter. So establishing a mandate, this is very important. It basically means identifying the scope of the functions of your HTA mechanism. So we go very briefly into why establish a mechanism for HTA, and then what questions or problem is to be corrected with the HTA mechanism. And the answer to that is, what are the functions that the HTA mechanism should be performing? And that goes into the second part. The third part is to define preparing for implementation. We won't go into that because that is actually tackled more in chapter 3. But basically to also say, when you are establishing your mandate, you should have a long-term vision in mind so that you can prepare for addition of more functions. And we will go into this in the next slide. So when and why is HDA done? I think you know this very well. This is the technology diffusion curve. And this is the time zero at the time of innovation. Then you have the preclinical and clinical evaluation. And then you have some sort of already seeding controlled diffusion through trials. At a certain point, it enters into the market and you get regulatory approval. And the desired diffusion of the technology would look something like this, so that once it is approved, you have a very fast uptake, so that there is no inequity, or there is very little inequity. Most of the people who need it would get it at the same time, and this would be maintained. And if the technology becomes obsolete, or if there is a new technology which is much better, you want almost a very complete substitution from the start. You don't want this being such a long tail on both ends, okay? And this is what we call trying to control the diffusion of the technology. And how does HDA help here? It is after the market approval that then, if it is linked very much to the financing mechanisms or reimbursement, that you are able to very quickly move from market approval to an HTA recommendation. And then reimbursement goes in and the service is available to the population who needs it. So this is the core HDA, which you will recognize: assessment, appraisal, and then a recommendation or decision. We have incorporated here the way we actually say it in the book. It's what we call the 3 Ds: data, assessment, deliberation for the appraisal, and or dialogue, and then we have a decision or recommendation. So this is the core HTA as we know it. Most countries would start with this. Most countries would start with pharmaceutical HTA, directly linked to essential medicines list, which is then a prerequisite for purchasing by the government. That would be the most common example and where most countries start. And then they would expand their HTA to procedures, to technology, to diagnostic tests, to even public health intervention. So this is it. Now, what are the additional functions that may be done? And you can see this in some HTA agencies. Some agencies like HITAP in Thailand would actually help in negotiating prices, and that would facilitate procurement, and that would allow better access to the population. The others, like NICE, would also go into clinical guidelines so that whatever is recommended for reimbursement, there would be better application of the technology, particularly if the decision on reimbursement actually specifies the indication for the use of the technology. So clinical guidelines would be in order to ensure that if the technology is approved, it is well implemented. Some, in even NICE, for example, in the UK, would even include quality assurance indicators. So that would also be another part under clinical guidelines. All of this is intended to hopefully successfully negotiate a lower price, and also successfully facilitate more effective implementation of the technology. When you do this, you can actually also look at something else, which goes to horizon scanning, which is basically, if you're able to perform this well, and you are able to handle the load or the burden of HTA, some are able, in fact, to look into the near future and identify technologies which are expected to have a major impact because they are either high-cost technologies or they anticipate that there will be a high demand for it. So if you are able to do horizon scanning, that's in fact means you are a little bit more advanced. You can handle more than what is currently on your plate. And this actually helps to prepare all of the decision-making bodies by providing them early notice about these new technologies. So this is the possible expansion of the different functions of the core HDA work. In these 23 countries who responded, let us see what they say about what they do. Most of them use HDA for planning and budgeting. I was actually surprised with this. Many of them say that they actually go into clinical practice guideline development, or maybe they partner with those who develop clinical practice guidelines, and they use it also primarily for design of health benefit package. It is a little bit used for public health programs, but the other uses of, or what I would say natural extensions of HDA, or I would say important extensions of HDA, like price negotiation and public procurement of medicines, or also putting in indicators of quality of care, and as mentioned, pricing and negotiations. Very few actually engage in this. So maybe these are potential areas where you could actually, as RedETSA, go a little bit more if this was of interest to the network. There is also something which we probably should mention at this point. It is getting a lot of traction as well, but we don't actually mention it in the book. This is the use of real-world evidence and planning these types of studies as part of an ongoing HDA, or where you give preliminary approval first, and then you start looking at how it is used and what are the outcomes in your own population. So this is the use of real-world evidence. And this also means setting up databases and patient registries. So we haven't, at the time this was decided to be the survey itself and even the book itself, we actually don't cover this. So this is also an area which is now becoming an important space. So this is also something that RedETSA could consider. So if you have decided on which functions that your HDA mechanism will perform, you would try to do a logical framework for your HDA mechanism, and you would put the functions here, and immediately beside that, you would put the outputs. So if you have an assessment mechanism within and appraisal mechanism within, you would be providing recommendations as well as the HDA assessment reports. If you actually do horizon scanning, then you'll have horizon scanning reports. So these two are easy to put in your logical framework. Then you have to, for the next chapter, look at what are needed, what are the inputs that you need in order to perform the functions, and then the final outcomes, what do you want to actually achieve. All of this means something which should be very familiar to you. It is our mantra. It is evidence-informed decisions lead to better the efficiency in spending and better health outcomes. This is what we say. And this is if we have a transparent, fair HDA process, which is enshrined in a legal framework. So why are we emphasizing this logical framework? One, it is going to guide you in terms of your planning and keeps you consistent with what you say you will do and what you will produce and what you will achieve. So I will also refer back to this once we reach chapter 5, where one of the first recommendations is for monitoring and evaluation is make sure you have a logical framework so that you can track this by putting indicators at each of these boxes. So chapter 2, this is a, when we were doing this in workshops, this was actually part of an area which I think as HTA practitioners, we generally ignore or actually are ignorant of, and we had to actually bring in lawyers to do this. So you might notice that there is a slight difference in the writing of this particular chapter. It is quite dense, and it uses a language with which we are not that familiar with. But I would actually encourage you to read this chapter as a whole, because it gives you an entirely different perspective, and it hopefully will give you an appreciation of how important it is to have a legal framework for your HTA mechanism. So this particular chapter goes through, helps you analyze the legal environment, and then helps you to bolster your HTA institutionalization or reform using the legal tools which are available to you. And then again, as always, with planning, it gives you a long-term view. It encourages you to monitor and adjust to new legal standards. Basically, this entire chapter, and I will go to this, it uses a four-pronged approach. It is to help decision makers, or actually HTA practitioners, to grasp the legal environment that rules HTA mechanisms. It is intended to support them in making the best of the rule of law to design HTA mechanisms. It also helps them to monitor and adjust the rule of law to preserve the relevance of HTA. And lastly, it highlights elements pertaining to the concept of the right to health as it is connected to HTA. Now, I must admit this particular part of this chapter is quite shallow, and I would say that for Latin America, with its history of the, I don't know if it translates in Spanish, judicialization of the right to health, with your experience in Colombia, Brazil on this, and the other Latin American countries, I think there are far better documents which you can read to give you a better understanding of this part. But the other parts are really eye-openers for a HTA practitioner who hasn't really been thinking about this. An example of what we have there is are the steps that are needed to be done when you are establishing your HTA mechanism. It is to review the legal system to understand which laws and regulations organize the health system. Actually, here you notice that it doesn't even say HTA system. It says the health system, because you have to put the HTA in the context of the health system and figure out how it fits. So this is the second one, which is determine where HTA functions or mechanisms fit or may fit in the legal and institutional system and the statutes, legislations, and regulations that apply. So it goes into the different kinds of laws, even from starting from the Constitution to administrative orders. It looks at the jurisdictions, from national jurisdictions to regional jurisdictions. So for example, it gives examples. Oh, all throughout this chapter, there are many examples as you would expect in a legal paper. So it gives examples, for example, of EU, where the EU regulation actually overrides the national legislation where it does apply. So the most important step, I think, in this particular chapter is to map the public authorities and institutions involved in HTA, and particularly looking at the devolution of powers and responsibilities, roles, and decision-making processes to each of these institutions at the supranational, at the national, and subnational level. So this is very important to make sure that your HTA mechanism has a very good legal framework and can operate within this and is actually protected from risks. So after doing this, you analyze the gaps and the bottlenecks. You identify the legal norms that should be updated, aligned, or modified. You review the legal risks, and I will not go into this part because it is a little bit not my area. It's better read in the chapter. And then you draw up an action plan to address the risks. So my recommendation is for those who have an incipient or a beginning HTA mechanism, or you want to reform your HTA mechanism, this is a very important chapter to really read, because this is something which, as HTA practitioners, I think there are better people who actually know about this and can actually do this better than us. But it would be good for us to have knowledge of this. So what is the situation in these 23 countries? First of all, legislation is about documentation and standardization. So one of the questions we had was, do you have a standard methodology or process guidelines for conducting an HTA? 8 of those countries said yes. Do you have legislative and regulatory requirements to consider the results of HTA, or is there a link of your HTA to policy making? And this is quite a soft question because it just says to consider the results of HTA, and you have 10 of those 23 countries responding yes. And finally, this is the strictest requirement. This is like NICE, for example, in the UK. Are the results of HTA considered binding by law and therefore should be implemented? And there were 4 countries which said this. So there is a considerable amount of work that can be done in this area among these countries which responded to the survey. So the third part is, the third chapter is establishing institutional and governance arrangements. So first of all, design an institutional arrangement. You have done your legal and institutional landscape mapping. So with that, you can design an institutional arrangement which fits into that context. So basically, you have mapped all the stakeholders relevant to HTA, stakeholders, particularly institutions. You will need to build the institutional capacity. You need to establish the capacity development plan according to the functions that you will perform. Will you do price negotiation as well? Will you do clinical guidelines as with NICE? Will you do horizon scanning? Or at what phase of development will you do it? So you need to analyze your gaps. Again, this is important. You have to conduct risk assessment. There are risks associated with issuing recommendations. So draw up an action plan to address the risks and develop the governance and operational structures. So an example of this would be what is the capacity needed to actually do all of this core HTA steps. So this is just the core HTA. It doesn't include the other extensions or functions. And you will need epidemiologists, health economists, ethicists, and other disciplines. HTA is always multidisciplinary. For the appraisal, you need to be able to particularly know about prevention and management of conflicts of interest, how to improve the interpretation of assessment of the data, and how to manage the deliberation and discussion of the stakeholders who are doing the appraisal. And finally, for recommendation, you should have expertise in terms of communicating the reasoning behind the recommendations, making sure that it is transparent, and understanding at the same time the legal implications of this. So what do we have in countries? These are the countries, and you can see what entity they have. There are 3 Latin American countries here. This is the entity doing their HDA, the number of staff involved, the time required to produce an HDA, the cost per HDA, and the operating budget. This is a bit dated now, but the important thing, or actually the most interesting thing to note here, is there is really a wide variety of budgets, number of staff, how many people are being employed, and what is their actual status. So I guess it merely shows that some of these are quite far advanced. Some of them have functions which is limited to core HTA and don't do price negotiation or clinical guidelines. So there are many explanatory factors for this. But how does that help you when you are planning how to set up your HTA mechanism? The first question is, do you have a budget for this? And so the question is, well, how do I put together a budget? I think that is very important. But let us just see what are the needs in these 23 countries who reported on the survey. So it's very clear that one of their basic problems is budget availability. Interestingly, there are also problems with data availability, human resources, dedicated human resources, and knowledge of methods. Knowledge of methods, let's go to the next figure. This was also a surprise for me, and it's not just the results from PAHO or these 23 countries from Latin America. It's actually a global finding from the other regions as well. Most of them are now looking for training or expertise at a higher level, even starting at the master's or PhD level. And very few are actually looking for courses, seminars, workshop, or internal staff training sessions. So again, we are going to look at this very carefully, and maybe one of the approaches of networks like RedETSA or wherever WHO can help is actually now setting up university-based courses on health technology assessment, if there are none or few in, or make them more accessible, these higher level courses, degree level courses in HTA. So this was a very interesting finding for us, and I hope also for RedETSA. I mean, 9 doesn't speak for all of your countries, but this is a very interesting thing which could make you think about what are the other maybe more sustainable or lasting ways of actually ensuring that you have dedicated capacity to do HTA. And finally, the question as well is, even as we know that every country has to have at least some minimum capacity in HTA, the question is, to what extent do you build it up? Do you aspire to have a NICE in your country, NICE in the UK? Do you want to have a similar big established institution? Well, let's look at the experience of EU. You know that most of the countries in EU already have established health technology agencies, but, and I go back to the initial reference we had in 2001, they were still, and note 2001, this is 20 years before. WHO Euro had a meeting which talked about institutionalizing HTA meeting. In 2004, the European Commission and the Council of Ministers actually said there is an urgent need for establishing a sustainable European network on HTA. You do have that now in RedETSA. It is several years already in existence. But what actually happened was in 2005, there were a series of the HTA, EU NETA projects, and this was funded by the EU Commission, really pushing the networking of these HTA institutions in EU. By 2017, the European Parliament went a step further and called on the Commission to propose legislation on health technology assessment at the EU or a supranational level. In 2018, there was a proposed EU regulation on HTA, and as recent as June 22, 2021, 20 years after, there is now an informal deal between the Council, which is their executive part, and the European Parliament to actually go ahead with the EU regulation. The new rules will become directly applicable in a staged process 3 years from entry into the force of the regulation. So the earliest this will become true is 2024. What does it mean? It means that the HTA applications will only be submitted once to an EU, once to the whole of EU. So you don't have to do it in each of the HTA bodies in EU. It will only be one submission. But a very important thing to remember, and this is very much consistent with global knowledge and local context, the regulation itself is just on clinical effectiveness. It doesn't include the cost effectiveness part. And of course, the decision to reimburse is still left to the national level. But very important, it says that cost effectiveness analysis, because of the different contexts available and the different financing mechanisms, that is left for each country to still do for themselves, and the decisions on reimbursement are, of course, at the national level. But this is a very, very big step. It is for efficiency. They find that they actually do the same systematic review on clinical effectiveness, and every one of them does that. And so the question is, does every country in the EU with an HTA agency need to do that, or can it be done once? So it is efficient from the perspective of the countries in EU. It is also equally efficient for the industry, which is proposing the new drug or the new device or the new procedure. So in both cases, I think it will be efficient for HTA mechanisms for industry, and hopefully this will get the products that are needed to the population faster. There is also one other important thing to remember about building capacity and operationalizing your HTA mechanism. You don't only look at HTA capacity of the producers of HTA, but you also need to improve the awareness of those who are actually going to use HTA in the decision making. So this is a very important barrier, which were identified by these 23 countries, the awareness, advocacy of the importance of HTA. And I think it goes beyond awareness. This is also probably the reasonable and judicious use of HTA assessments, the interpretation of the results, particularly uncertainties, and being able to look at all the criteria and judge for themselves whether this is something that they would recommend. So chapter 4 is a little bit more familiar to us. It is about processes and evidence required for assessment and appraisal, but this is very operational. Again, this is not about how to do an HTA. It is how do you establish an appraisal committee? How do you decide what are the criteria for assessment and appraisal? It's how do you decide. It is not what are the criteria, okay? How do you actually collect the criteria and get consensus on the criteria? How do you identify how each criteria is to be reported? How do you put together a benchmark? How do you actually interpret an impact on equity if you don't have a quantitative measure, okay? And finally, also, how do you put together the terms of reference of the appraisal committee? How do you handle conflicts of interest, okay? So how do you develop recommendations? And finally, How do you make sure that you have a setup for communicating the results? How do you put together a setup for handling appeals? So let's go into the part on criteria. We have a 2014 document in WHO which says making fair choices on the path to universal health coverage. And here it says most services or interventions or products can be classified into priority classes. And they recommend, this was a group composed of ethicists, philosophers, economists, and policymakers. They say the most relevant criteria are those related to cost effectiveness and equity, particularly priority, giving priority to the worst off, and also financial risk protection. They go further and say, first, expand coverage for high priority services to everyone. So high priority services are those that are cost effective, those that give priority to the worst off, and those who offer financial risk protection. This includes eliminating out-of-pocket payments while increasing mandatory progressive prepayment with pooling of funds. But actually, this is very important for those doing HDA and HDA mechanisms. One of the things I always say in HDA seminars is for HDA practitioners or mechanisms not to make themselves an instrument for inequity when they approve new interventions or procedures or new technologies. How do you actually inadvertently promote inequity? You do that when there are very few who are able to actually access the services. If, for example, there are very few specialists, clinical specialists who can actually do the procedure. There are very few laboratories or X-ray machines who can actually monitor the side effects of these specialized drugs, or very few who can actually do the diagnostic tests or monitoring tests. So what I'm saying is, I remember this was something very basic before, but when we were working in Thailand before, and they were deciding whether to recommend coverage of renal replacement therapy, dialysis, including renal transplantation, the first things they did were to, first of all, canvass where were the dialysis centers, how many transplant surgeons and nurses and teams did they have, everything in terms of where can these interventions be delivered. And one of the questions in their mind was really, are we promoting an urban-rural inequity in approving this? So I think this is one of the key things that we say, that when we as just being very technocratic about this, don't actually think about the impact when it's actually rolled out, that we might be facilitating inequity. So this publication is available, and please just remember there should be a fair and progressive realization of universal health coverage. Do not be an instrument of increasing inequity without thinking of the feasibility of universally providing the interventions. The final chapter talks about monitoring and evaluation of the HDA work. So it is to prepare for monitoring and evaluation. You review the mandate and the functions, and you identify the stakeholders who will be the recipients of the results of the monitoring evaluation. You go back to your logic model, the first one of the first slides, and you select the key indicators to tell you how you are doing in each of these boxes. You design a structure for routine monitoring and dissemination. You develop a work plan for how you will do the monitoring and evaluation, and you actually prepare for a summative evaluation by making sure you have a baseline data, and maybe after 3 or 5 years or 10 years, you will then do a summative evaluation in terms of the value that has been contributed by the HDA mechanism. One of the best that has been done is one that has actually shown remember that there was a question about the lack of budgets for many of these HTA mechanisms. Some of the best evaluations of HTA mechanisms have shown how much they have been able to save by making these recommendations, and what the cost of running an HTA mechanism is. It's a very small proportion of this potential savings because HTA was done. So that is something which we can also do to actually ask for a real working budget. How do you assess your monitoring and evaluation? You actually have to assess and monitoring three things. One is the mechanism itself, the structure, how many people you have, what is the budget, are you increasing this? What are the products? How many health technology assessments have you done? What is the quality of those products? And then the process itself, how were the stakeholders involved? Was there transparency? Did you influence decisions or recommendations? These are attributes which you can look at to actually check if you have a good monitoring and evaluation mechanism. It prescribes the necessary attributes of your monitoring and evaluation mechanism. Okay. Finally, we are trying to put together a maturity model, which basically has 4 phases of maturity for an HTA mechanism. And these are the proposed parameters on which we will be able to classify the HTA mechanisms for each country, starting from emerging capacity for HTA to sustained capacity. So if you remember that graph before with the arrow, this is now a more, hopefully a better specified maturity model with which one can actually track the progress of HTA mechanisms. So I'll end with this and turn it over to Alex. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tessa, for a wonderful presentation. And we're very glad we have almost 150 participants at this moment. So you can see that all the interest for your presentation and the publication. So thank you very much. I just want to mention I forgot to mention in the beginning that you reminded me during your presentation of the chapter 4. We have the participation of my colleague Carla Sainz Pajo. In fact, I invited her to participate in this webinar to be like make comments about the chapter as well. But unfortunately, she's on leave. Unfortunately for us, not for her. she's having a nice vacation. But unfortunately, we could not have her with us today. So thank you very much. I will ask for our participants if you can stay 15 minutes more, and so we can have a few questions from our participants. So I will hand over to Francisco Cacavo, who's going to moderate the Q&A session. Francisco, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Tessa, for such a great and wonderful presentation. I'm going to switch to Spanish now. Bueno, gracias a todos. Tenemos muchos saludos y felicitaciones aquí en el chat, destacando la buena que fue la presentación. Y es bueno ver también, no voy a mencionar a nadie en particular, pero tantos amigos de la red, también de participantes haciendo comentarios. Bueno, aprovecho para mencionar, porque varios han preguntado si la presentación va a estar disponible o si podrán tener acceso. Como todos los webinars, va a estar disponible en el sitio web de RedETSA, en www.redetsa.org. Las preguntas pueden hacerlas en el chat o en Q&A. Es quizás más sencillo y más prolijo en el chat, perdón, en el Q&A, pero ya tenemos algunas en el chat, así que vamos a empezar leyendo esas. Les pedimos también, si pueden, cuando hagan la pregunta, indicar su país e institución, así podemos presentar a todos mejor. Bueno, vamos a empezar entonces. La primera pregunta es de nuestra colega Gabriela Carrasco, que es de RedETSA, Argentina, de la provincia de Neuquén, ahora está trabajando con nosotros de voluntaria aquí en Pajo. Y Gabriela pregunta, la leo en inglés: Hi Tessa, should HTA recommendations be binding? ¿Las recomendaciones de evaluación de tecnologías sanitarias deberían ser vinculantes?
I think that very much depends on the context in the country. What you do want is that the results will be directly used by the policymakers. The main reason why it might not be binding is because the HTA agency might not have, even if they do a budget impact analysis, might not really be able to anticipate the overall impact of introduction of that intervention on the total budget of the financing scheme or the reimbursement agency. So usually, I will give you an example of what we recommended in the Philippines. Basically, the recommendation from the HTA agency should be taken up explicitly by the health insurance, the national health insurance, and should give a very good reason. And usually the only reason that they can give is budget feasibility. They cannot question the results of the HTA. That's one way of doing it, but there's also the important part that they put in. They also said that the National Health Insurance Agency cannot approve any intervention or technology that has not gone through the HTA agency and has been recommended. So it ties it very closely to the financing scheme or to the health insurance, but it doesn't impose in its recommendation in the sense that it says it trusts the National Health Insurance Agency to be able to show that they can afford this intervention being recommended, or if not, they can give their actuarial projections, for example, to show that it will be too heavy an impact. So there are examples with NICE where it's where what they recommend is basically should be implemented within the I can't say UK, England, I think Scotland, I'm not so sure now, but definitely in England, it is immediately for implementation. But if you read some of the studies of this, then the implicit rationing will then occur in the other aspects of healthcare, so that they will, quote unquote, deliver this new intervention, but implicit rationing will occur in the others. And we don't want that. The whole idea is they should be explicit and they should be accountable for it. So I hope that answers your question. It's a very difficult question to answer, and I'm sure there are many perspectives on this, and mine is only one perspective. Over.
Muchas gracias, Tessa. Un punto muy importante y claramente una respuesta muy interesante que va al punto. Tenemos también otras preguntas, tanto en Q&A como en el chat. Tenemos una de Reina Perla, quizás un poco específica en algún sentido, pero Reina Perla quizás puede después ponernos de qué país e institución es. Pregunta, ¿cuáles serían sus impresiones y o recomendaciones acerca de contar con una iniciativa para promover una agencia o entidad de evaluación de tecnologías sanitarias regional centroamericana bajo el marco jurídico del Sistema de Integración Centroamericana?
Okay, so I'm not aware about this Central American Integration Initiative, but I think I am going to cite the EU experience on this. And I am basically saying, when we are looking at how to assist our member states, my question is, do we have to go through 20 years of trying to build up our own HTA agencies when we see already that the EU, with all of their resources, are basically saying this is not the right way to go? And therefore, can we not learn their lesson now rather than wait for the next 20 years? So what we are actually doing is, within ASEAN, for example, that's in Asia, we actually have a work plan now to explore looking at having a regional approach to HTA. That is a little bit more advanced, but it has not been implemented because COVID stepped in. In the African Union, they now have a health economics unit, and there is now also an idea that HTA at a regional level can be built up there. So all I'm saying is, just look, and this is why I spent one whole slide on the EU, and you already have a background of RedETSA and networking, whether you should actually try to think about this. You still have the recurrent problems of budget availability, of technical capacity, and what efficiencies can be gained by regionalizing. And the sooner you think about it as a network, maybe the earlier you can try addressing this, and maybe also try at the same time institutionalizing it. But of course, that this is me coming from Geneva. I don't actually know the actual context in your region. So it is just an example which you could consider in terms of efficiency. Over.
Muchas gracias, Tessa. Sin duda una perspectiva importante para el punto de la regionalización de la evaluación de tecnologías. Tenemos entonces aquí otra pregunta, que ahora en este caso en el Q&A, de Miguel Trillo, que dice, bueno, felicitaciones. ¿Qué elementos cree que son indispensables para establecer una política de medicamentos de alto costo? Una pregunta un poquito más amplia, quizás Miguel Trillo después puede decirnos la institución y su país. Over.
Okay. Definitely for high-cost medicines, you need to have an HTA. I think this is a very difficult question. As always, the approach is, for me, for cost effectiveness, that would be the first criteria. And then you need to think about opportunity costs of what you actually give up if you look at this, if you actually recommend this high-cost medicine for reimbursement, knowing that once you actually recommend it, unless a new drug comes in, or that drug is found to be harmful or has too many side effects, that you cannot take it back. Like I remember again in Thailand, they said, once you give the sugar cane to the elephant, you cannot take it back. So it's the same. Once you already recommend it for reimbursement, and the financing scheme actually puts it in, it will be there, and you cannot take it out unless a new drug comes in, which is better, or it turns out to be harmful. So you need to think about this in terms of, and this is why there is also horizon scanning, that people actually look at that and also want to see what do we have now, what do we anticipate in the future, because actually for budget management, you know, most countries would actually do what they call, they don't do budgeting really on a one-year annual basis. They do what they call medium-term revenue and expenditure framework. So it should be the same, and that's partly why horizon scanning is coming in, because they basically need to look at what am I spending now and what do I expect to spend in the next 2 or 3 years. So the only other thing I need to say is for high-cost medicine, sometimes it's not just cost effectiveness, which is the, or how would I say it? Some of them would have cost effectiveness thresholds, and some would actually adjust the cost effectiveness thresholds if the disease is very severe, if it is life-saving, if it is a rare disease. So there are those who actually, some countries, I'm not saying this is the approach you should use, but I'm saying that some countries have considered this, that in terms of high-cost medicines, then they look at this changing a little in terms of the cost effectiveness threshold by coupling the cost effectiveness threshold to other considerations, like is it a very severe disease and it's a very effective drug. But of course, the main thing in the end is always the budget impact, and then what are the expected opportunity costs associated with agreeing to finance this this technology. I just want to put actually this COVID-19 vaccines in this, in HTA and in the HTA context. And one sort of says, you know, in this particular environment of a pandemic, because of the high visibility associated with this, this is where the rule of rescue comes in. Nobody bothers to, well, they still do effectiveness assessments of this COVID-19 vaccines, but nobody cares what the costs are, whether now or in the future, because it is such it has such a great health impact and also has such a great economic impact. So there are many other considerations, rule of rescue, severity, etc., that will help that will give you a different perspective when looking at high-cost medicines. But it is a realization, in the end, you cannot afford everything for your entire population, and you should think about opportunity costs, and you should also think about equity and asking who will actually have access to these high-cost medicines. And here, you very well know the history that you have on tutelas and the judicialization of the right to care. And most of these were about high-cost drugs, and it was about individuals who could afford to go to court to get their right to health, to get that access to a very expensive high-cost medicine. So I would actually defer to you in terms of your experience and the philosophies behind this. And this is where I hope Carla Sáenz would have been here to help answer those questions. Over.
Thank you very much, Tessa. Indeed, hard question and interesting question. Okay, I'm switching to another question in the chat. Again, our colleague Gabriela Carrasco, she's asking, well, thank you, Tessa. Should patient societies be included?
Sorry, can I just go back to the previous question also? For the question on, when I keep on mentioning opportunity cost, what other countries have done for high-cost medicines is they have separated the funding for it. So they have a funding for high-cost medicines so that it doesn't eat into the general fund. But I'll give you the example of the Cancer Fund in the UK, which they set up because there was such a strong advocacy for it, but now they've taken it out. They don't have that fund anymore, and it's back to no special considerations. It's back to the usual HTA with NICE. So just to mention that as well. So the question of Gabriela, I think, is should we include patient societies? as a general rule, you would include in the deliberative process the all of the relevant stakeholders. So of course, patients would be there. But of course, the question is, how do you decide on who are the patient representatives? And I think one needs to be very careful about choosing a patient representative or a patient society or a society of patients that is independent and doesn't have any conflict of interest. We do know that for many of this, well, I wouldn't say for many, but there are documented cases of patient societies being supported by the industry. So we just need to be very careful about choosing, but definitely they have to be there. It is just, how do you manage the conflict of interest? How are you able to actually ensure independence and the voicing of the real patients, and not patients voicing industry and what industry wants to say? Over.
Thank you, Tessa. So unfortunately, we don't have much time to having all questions we are having here. We're going to one more question from Pedro Galván from Paraguay. So he's saying, can you tell us about your experience in the Philippines regarding binding HTA reports to decision-making during the pandemic?
Okay, I have to say that I'm not in the Philippines and I haven't been there for the past 20 years. So I've been in Geneva, and actually I would say I am more involved in other countries rather than the Philippines. So it's I think, as with any country, it is grab any vaccine that you can get a supply of. And the thing that they say is, any vaccine is good as long as it is in your arm. So I think that is the general recommendation of WHO at the moment. And I think that doesn't change for whatever country. Over. It doesn't, we don't require an HTA for it. And actually it's done as a public health measure. That's the other thing. It wasn't done through reimbursement in the Philippines. So it was done by funding through the national government, and usually in cases of emergency, that is the case. This is covered by emergency funding and not from the health insurance funding. Although the care of COVID-19 patients, as is the problem with many countries, it's imposing a great financial burden for many of the national health insurance agencies, which of course were not able to predict this black swan event, as they call it. And so it has imposed such a big financial problem to them, because particularly of the use of ICU. Over.
Thank you very much, Tessa. Bueno, pido disculpas a aquellos a quienes no llegamos a responder sus preguntas. Creo que algunas, al menos lateralmente, hemos podido, los temas fueron también tocados. Bueno, se nos está acabando el tiempo, así que paso la palabra a Alexandre para el cierre.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Thank you, Tessa. You can see the lots of questions that we didn't have time to go to all of the questions, but so that only shows the level of interest and how well received was your presentation. So thank you very much for your time, for being with us. I would like to thank all of our RedETSA members. As I mentioned, we have around 150 participants, and still right now that we go over the time, we have more than 130 participating in the Q&A session. So thank you very much for all of the participants, all of the questions, all of the active participation. And of course, as always, thank you very much for Francisco, Abraham, Gabriela, for all the help of organizing this session. So I would hand over for a final comments and from Tessa before we close.
No, I just want to say that I am very happy have been with you, and I was very honored with this invitation, and I want to thank Alexander and Francisco for giving me the chance to interact with you. I hope we have more opportunities in the future, and I look forward to those. Over.
For sure, for sure. We'll make sure to have you again soon. And let's explore the possibility of translating in Spanish, at least for the region, for dissemination. So let's talk this later. Okay, so thank you very much again. And for all of the RedETSA friends, stay safe. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias por la participación y quedamos en contacto como siempre y para nuestras próximas actividades. Muchas gracias. Saludos a todos y a todas. Chao.